Welcome everyone to our webinar at Creation Justice Ministries. It looks like from the chat function, we have a diverse representation of people across the country, especially representing those who are experiencing some very hot weather this summer. And so welcome everyone. I am Karen Bigelow, one of two co-executive directors for Creation Justice Ministries. We want to welcome everyone to this session around extreme heat. We are officially now in the midst of the summer, which means that many of our communities are going to be impacted by extreme temperatures. And so tonight, we will have the opportunity to hear from our expert panel about the intersections of heat, health, and its disparate impacts on BIPOC communities. We will also hear about some of the tangible steps that our churches can take in our community and larger national policy. We will have time later in this hour to actually go over questions that you may all have. And so please, as things come up, please put questions in the Q&A function and we will get to them once we get to our time after our presentations today. But before we get started with hearing from our speakers, being Creation Justice Ministries, it's only befitting that we start off with a prayer. And so if you will join me in prayer, I like to take 2 seconds before I start, so please know that if there's an awkward silence, that it's intentional. So please join me in prayer. God, as the heat of summer intensifies, we pray for those without air conditioning or electricity, clean water, or healthcare. For all our neighbors in survival mode, give them the communities and resources to not only survive, but to be able to thrive this summer and be safe. And Lord, remind us to give you a drink when we see you thirsty, as how we treat others is how we treat you. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. So thank you everyone for coming. I'm gonna do a quick introduction of our panel for today. As mentioned before, we will hear from experts and practitioners in this work, and we will hear from them all shortly. We're going to start off with hearing from Ella Mendoza, who is a Health Equity Program Manager at the NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council. We will now hear, later we'll hear from Morgan Zabo. Apologies, Morgan, if I mispronounced your name, who is a Community Heat and Health Information Coordinator at NOAA, which is the government agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Then we'll hear from Reverend Sylvia Harris, who is a Wesley United Methodist Church pastor in Phoenix, Arizona. And then lastly, we'll hear from Christian Brooks, who is an environmental and climate justice consultant at CBN Consulting. And so I'm going to turn it now over to Ella to be able to talk about the work that is happening at NRDC and just to really set the context for why this issue is important.
Thanks, Morgan. It's just going to take me a minute to get my screen shared. One moment. All right, I think we should be good to go.
Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Okay, great. So as Karen mentioned, I'm Ella Mendoza. I'm based in DC. I work in the NRDC Equity Center, and I work particularly with communities of color and low-income communities on health equity and very timely on health impacts from climate change. So today I just wanted to go through some of the topics that we think are all experiencing now on extreme heat, talk about what it is, who it impacts, talk about the urban heat island phenomenon and how we got here historically, and then end with some of the best practices on extreme heat. So we'll start with something relatively, basic. Globally, we are experiencing the impacts of climate change intensifying each year. The US average temperature rises each year, and the world is now warming faster than at any point in recorded history. So why are we experiencing this growing heat? Well, we've known for decades that human activities have been the main driver of our warming planet. So as we dig coal, oil, and pipe gas out of the earth, and burn it for fuel and energy, this leads to emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs. that make up greenhouse gas emissions. Those get trapped and then they warm the planet. And so this fossil fuel use really accounts for about 75% of global GHGs or greenhouse emissions. There are other choices that we make that lead to a hotter planet, like cutting down forests that absorb carbon dioxide, car and freight transportation, food production, and just general overconsumption and oftentimes greed. So just a handful of corporations are the largest GHG emissions emitters, but we really all have a part to play in the climate crisis, particularly if you live in the US or the global north. So what is extreme heat specifically? It is defined broadly in the US as any extended high heat or humidity above 90 degrees. So that can be something, 2 or 3 days or even longer. So what does that mean? And how rapidly is that happening? So it depends on how much, and how many fossil fuels we're actually digging out of the ground. We've known for decades that human drivers have been the main, that human activities have been the main driver. And as it gets hotter, for me, I really think about DC where I live. If you're 30 and born in DC, the year you were born, we had about 24 extreme heat days. Now, if you were 40, you're 10 years older. When you were born, at least in DC, there are about 17 days of extreme heat. If you're 50, your birth year, there were 13 days of extreme heat. Now, between 40 and 50, you're like, okay, that's not, that's about 4 days. But now on average, we have 30 plus a year. And so by the time, you're 80 or I'm 80, that could be about 50 days up to 72 days of extreme heat a year. So that just rapidly shifts kind of the way that we are living now and the seasons that we have. And so this information was pulled from the Climate Impact Lab. But for me, it's always really good to kind of think like, when we say it's getting hotter, we actually can kind of estimate more and more what that would look like and how much hotter, but also how much longer of our year it's going to look like this. So with this extreme heat, what are the impacts? It's just hot, right? Well, the deadliest impact of climate change is extreme heat, resulting in over 1,300 deaths a year in the United States. Firstly, more days of extreme heat lead to an increased rate and severity of wildfires and drought. We hear a lot about heat stroke, heat exhaustion, dehydration, and some of these short-term exposure outcomes, but these actually make up a smaller percentage of the health outcomes than you would think. And we really rarely talk about some of the other severe physical health and mental health, often longer-term outcomes due to repeated exposure. So individuals who are exposed to moderate or extreme heat over time can really face higher risk of respiratory, neurological, heart issues, cancer, and even death at an accelerated rate. So during heat waves, there are increased rates of accidents, emergency room calls, hospital visits, and for both physical and mental health outcomes. And as we mentioned, extreme heat is expected to continue to rise. And new research shows that race is actually a better indicator of exposure to extreme heat than income. So most often, Black residents and residents of color experience higher exposures to extreme heat than their white counterparts, even within the same city or county. So that can even be like on a neighborhood or block level. And so these climate stressors can also worsen mental health and result in increased levels of stress, anxiety, and even PTSD. So who is impacted most? As I mentioned, we all likely are feeling impacts, as it gets hot in the summer. We probably can note, it's been hotter in the last few summers, but those who are impacted most are, those with pre-existing health conditions, the elderly and young children, pregnant people, people of color, low-income residents, outdoor workers. That includes delivery, gig workers, agricultural workers. That can also include indoor workers who maybe do not have air conditioning or their offices aren't really set up for the extreme heat that we have, unhoused people, and incarcerated people. So all of the impacts we're going to talk about today, these are folks who are much greater risks of having those short-term or those longer-term outcomes. So one of the major things, if we talk about cities that folks can experience, is an urban heat island. So, and the urban heat island phenomenon really refers to an urban or metropolitan area that has higher temperatures than the surrounding areas, largely because it's covered in asphalt, cement, brick, glass, steel, and dark roofs. These areas lack vegetation and green space, and the materials, like asphalt, cement, they absorb heat from the sun, from cars, from humans, and they really just hold it and then release it slowly over time. And largely, water runs off those surfaces. It doesn't really allow for kind of cooling transpiration, which is a process where water is kind of absorbed by vegetation and allows the area to stay cooler. So this is something you've probably noticed on a smaller scale. What is hotter, being in an asphalt parking lot or being in a natural substance like grass or water? But some key cities that have examples of just really, really stark difference between an urban heat island, which can be as small as a building or a block, or much, much larger, are Houston, New Orleans, Newark, New York City, San Francisco, and there are so many others. Likely in your own city or town, you'll actually have an urban heat island effect. And so many cities and urban planners are now working to address these design choices because they can impact quality of life and health outcomes from rising extreme heat. But with that, I'm going to move into kind of how we got here. So we know about extreme heat, we recognize the health impacts, who that impacts, and the idea that cities and urban environments are sometimes facing higher heat. We should also talk a little bit about how this actually came to be. Extreme heat, like most forms of extreme weather, disproportionately impacts communities of color and lower income neighborhoods. And it isn't an accident. This was very intentional, and it has its roots in segregation and housing discrimination. So in 1934, under FDR, the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, was created, and it developed a housing mortgage underwriting manual that maps the whole country and downgraded Black or mixed neighborhoods all of their mortgage prices. Black folks could not get loans in this system. People of color probably could not get loans under this system. Jewish people had trouble getting loans in this system. So the FHA really circled these neighborhoods in red in their housing guide, and that really created the practice of redlining, which led to county zoning departments really further segregating neighborhoods by race and taking those redlinings where you could not get a mortgage or they downgraded a mortgage, and really building that into the practice of the city and county. So the federal support from the Federal Housing Administration led to a big boom in mortgages, but only to white residents. That effectively pushed out a lot of people of color, Black folks, Jewish people, anyone considered non-white out of cities. So then with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, segregation in private and public areas was no longer legally defended at the federal level, but it was still defended in many states and counties across the US. And so these effectively redlined cities and neighborhoods were targets of white flight, but also historic disinvestment, active policies like racial covenants or language written in the deed that disallowed Black people or largely people of color, even after the practice of segregation was ended federally. And so you'll see a quote at the top of this very real sign that is included in a housing deed. That's what a racial covenant is. It really means that even though federally homes could now go to people of color, people could write into their deed of their home that even when they sold it, it could never be sold to a person of color. And this is in Virginia. This was actually defended until far later, I think 30 years after the Fair Housing Act was actually passed. So let me make sure. Okay. Yeah. So knowing all of that about housing discrimination, what does that actually mean for us today? Well, county zoning did really continue on many of the discriminatory housing practices and policies today. And so even 90 years, at least after those maps were created, a study of about 108 urban areas nationwide um, showed that formerly redline neighborhoods of nearly every city were studied, and they were hotter than non-redline neighborhoods, some by nearly 13 degrees. And if you think about the difference in, 93 and 80, right, or 50 and 63, that is a lot of temperature difference. And it can really be the difference between extreme heat and heat risk. So 90 years is like two 45-year-olds. And currently today, in another study that just came out, in 71% of counties, people of color live in neighborhoods with higher temperature than their white counterparts. And in 76% of counties, lower income people experience hotter temperatures than wealthier ones. So, did I jump ahead? I guess I have, that's all right. So there are a lot of solutions to extreme heat. We can actually, through two main ways, adaptation and mitigation. So climate mitigation really means that we are going to stop it at the source, which means moving away from fossil fuel technology. And for that, you can really be an advocate at really every level, at the local, at the city, at the state. Try to get your city to stop using particular technology that is fossil fuel focused. Maybe from, regular cars, there's a chance to move to an electric fleet. There are so many options if we push for them. But also as individuals, we can move to green energy, plant trees in our neighborhood, push our cities and communities to plant trees. We can support community cooling centers, move away from infrastructure that is, dark and has impermeable substances. And so that means like they hold that heat and move towards cool or white or light roofs and roadways. And there's about 100 more options. You can bike, walk, take public transportation when you can. And we can all be making way better individual decisions about our health and the planet. You can reduce the red meat you eat from livestock that has a large carbon footprint. But the truth is, large polluters and fossil fuel companies continuing like they are now, we will still be experiencing extreme heat, and we'll be experiencing it at a greater rate and for much more of our year. So we have to make good individual choices, but we also have to make sure that we're holding those accountable. And so with that, I think I can move right into my email. So please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to share resources that are all the studies that we referenced, but also some great tips for how to keep your city cool and how to keep your home cool over summer.
Thank you so much, Ella. And we're going to turn it over now to Morgan to talk more about how churches can respond to extreme heat in their respective cities.
Thank you so much. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Apologies. My camera sometimes does not work when I share a screen, and that's where we are. So good evening or afternoon, depending upon where you are. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. My name is Morgan Zabo, and I am the Community Heat and Health Information Coordinator with NOAA's Climate Program Office. And I'm going to be presenting today on our Urban Heat Island Mapping Campaign program and looking at ways that faith-based organizations can get involved with the program and address heat in their community. So Ella did a great job with some context settings, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I just wanted to reinforce the heat issue. And extreme heat kills more Americans each year than any other weather-related event. And it's often referred to as the silent killer because we do not see the impacts as clearly as a hurricane or a tornado. And not only is heat a silent killer, but extreme heat is also an overlooked issue. From the mere fact that the impacts are invisible at some points, the impacts may be delayed, and the impacts are hard to quantify. And while everyone is at risk of extreme heat, some groups are much more disproportionately affected by heat-related illnesses than others. For instance, outdoor workers and athletes are at a greater risk than office workers because they have increased exposure to heat. Other groups may be disproportionately affected by the effects of high heat as a result of age or poor health, or the lack of resources that enable them to adapt or recover, such as people experiencing homelessness, incarcerated people, low-income communities, and much more. And of course, in many instances, we wait too long to plan and prepare for these events and are not ready for when heat waves do strike. And so for many years, many federal agencies worked separately on components of extreme heat. But to better serve the American people on this issue and provide a coordinated federal response, NOAA and the CDC launched the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, or NIHIS, in 2015 to develop and provide actionable science-based information to help protect the nation from heat. And NIHIS spans many agency missions and mandates to deliver solutions faster and more efficiently. And you can see a list of our partner agencies at the bottom of this slide. NIHIS consists of an interagency working group, as well as a partner network that allows us to engage with our state, local, tribal, NGO, academic partners, international partnerships. And while NIHIS has many different working groups and projects, today I'm going to be speaking to you about our Urban Heat Island Mapping Campaign program. So in this program, we are examining the urban heat island effect, which is that cities are typically much warmer than nearby rural areas, especially during the summer, as cities' roads and buildings gain heat during the day and radiate that heat into the surrounding air, which can lead to cities in some instances being 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than areas with more green space. So to learn where action is needed to protect vulnerable populations now and in the future, NIHIS and partners launch community-led campaigns that map the hottest parts of cities to understand heat distribution across communities. Since 2017, NOAA has been working with private sector company Kappa Strategies and communities across the country, again, to map these urban heat islands. Our UHI campaign is a community science project that relies on volunteers and organizers from each city or county to collect the temperature data, which leads to education about heat and health, as well as a deeper understanding of how heat is impacting their community. And you can see some photos of volunteers conducting the mapping on the right-hand side. The mapping campaigns are run by participating cities, local organizations, again, and rely on volunteers to travel around the city, collecting data with proper equipment attached to their car or bikes, which you can see in the photos. The final product of the campaign is a set of high-resolution air temperature and humidity data, and a report that provides a detailed analysis of distribution of heat in the morning, afternoon, and evening. And you can see an example of this on the left-hand side. This is a map from Atlanta, Georgia, which was mapped in 2021. So again, we've been running our UHI campaign program since 2017, with our first city being Richmond, Virginia. And since then, we've mapped more than 70 communities across the country, including this year's group of campaign cities, and mapped 2 international cities earlier this year for the first time. I especially want to highlight the map on the left side, which shows the cities being mapped this summer. If a city that you are located in is conducting a heat mapping campaign, you may want to partner with them to do outreach efforts or serve as a distribution hub for the campaign. Your organization may want to be a cooling center on days where your community is under a heat advisory, watch or warning, and spreading the word about this effort may be a great way to educate your community about the role you play to provide relief to residents experiencing heat. And on the last slide, I'll have my contact information that you can contact me with any questions about the campaigns or email me so that I can connect you with a particular campaign city to get involved. And so with these campaigns, the cities and counties are able to learn where the hottest neighborhoods are in order to provide and implement solutions in these neighborhoods. And more often than not, those neighborhoods tend to be disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by environmental factors. One example of this is the map you see on the right side of Northern Manhattan and the Bronx, which was mapped in 2021 as part of our program. The wealthier, more affluent neighborhoods were revealed to be much cooler than neighborhoods that were predominantly minority neighborhoods. Additionally, this campaign paired data with historical redlining maps and found overlaps between the hottest neighborhoods and neighborhoods that were historically redlined. Therefore, this mapping campaign is able to identify the hottest and most vulnerable neighborhoods and communities in hopes that these communities will implement solutions to protect these populations. And finally, I want to note that there have been a lot of outcomes from this project, as we have seen communities working with their local decision makers to implement cooling solutions to provide relief to residents. So for example, the data from our Urban Heat Island Mapping program was incorporated into the City of Houston's comprehensive resilience strategy, It was used by Honolulu, Hawaii Chief Resilience Officer to inform tree planting. The city of Raleigh was able to fund asphalt renovations to increase solar reflectivity to decrease their UHI effect. Las Vegas, Nevada was able to add shade structures to bus shelters to give relief to bus riders. Additionally, campaigns have been used by science museums in Boston and Richmond to develop public education events, and so many other examples. So there's a wide variety of ways that we have that the mapping data can be used. And I think a great way that this group of faith-based organizations can get involved. And I see many examples of faith-based organizations serving as cooling centers, a place where residents can come and get some rest and cool down from the heat. And I will say on that note, some major feedback we've gotten from people who have used cooling centers in the past, and that can be cooling centers like a library, a mall, whatever it may be, have been that some, do not allow pets, and some do not want to leave their pets home alone, especially in an unair conditioned space, or that they do not stay open late to provide relief, which is a major problem because if nighttime temperatures in the home do not get below 80 degrees, people are at a higher risk of heat-related illness. Additionally, people may also need a source of transportation to get there, or some people have unfortunately faced stigmas for a variety of different reasons. And that being said, I think faith-based organizations have a unique perspective in the community to be a safe place for people to find relief from extreme heat. And your organizations can partner with a variety of different stakeholders in your cities, states to do this. And my last slide is I just want to note that we did launch heat.gov last summer with the Biden administration, and it is the premier source of information for the nation for extreme heat and health. And you can find a variety of information from how heat is impacting you now and in the future, planning and preparing guides, learning more about heat, and of course, all the information about urban heat islands you can want. So thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be presenting to you today.
Thank you so much, Morgan, for your presentation. We're now going to go and turn over to Reverend Sylvia Harris, who is a pastor at Wesley United Methodist Church of Phoenix.
Thank you, Karen. So unlike my fellow presenters, I am used to preaching in a low-tech context. So you're just going to listen to me talk. I don't have pretty slides or any of that stuff to share with you. I just want to walk you through the process of how Wesley became one of the cooling centers that some of my colleagues on this call have already mentioned as being an approach to helping address the inequities of heat and especially the extreme heat. So as Karen said, I serve at Wesley United Methodist Church, which is located in Phoenix, Arizona. And Phoenix, in many ways, much of Arizona is on the forefront of the extreme heat and trying to address that. We have not had much relief. This summer's been slow rolling into it, but we are now into those overnight lows, not dropping below 80 degrees. And so it turns into a very deadly situation. The church I serve is located between some of those red lines that Ella mentioned already. You can recognize it because it's located between Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard and Cesar Chavez Boulevard, which is where then the community refers to as South Phoenix. And by the community, I mean the larger Phoenix community. The people who live there prefer to reference their home as being in the South Mountain area of Phoenix to try to help combat the prejudicial attitudes that target this geographical area. This part of the city has historically had large numbers of Black residents and has been targeted with different initiatives to keep them impoverished. For example, it wasn't until the latter half of the 20th century that some of the homes and housing had running water. So they have faced systemic oppression and situations that lead to economic disparities. More recent years, the demographic shift within the radius of the church has increased dramatically with a growing Hispanic population, which now makes up over 65% of the people living within that 3-mile radius of the church. And as we were going into the summer months of last year, we were pulling statistical data from the 21-22 winter months, and that data showed dramatic increases in our unsheltered neighbor population below poverty line and significantly below poverty line neighbors, letting us know that we are located in an area of extreme poverty and need. So then as we entered into the spring of last year, we knew we needed to do something. You could see the the need on the street, quite literally passing tents and people living unsheltered, and decided what could we do, because we know we are called to help people have life, and not just life, but life abundant. And the irony of that is that Wesley is a very small community. And so it is not as if this church has an abundance of monetary things lying around or financial resources lying around. What they did have to offer, though, was a heart for justice and love, and space that was non judgmental for respite. And so through creative visioning, we realized we could build something new in a it's a 2-building property. One of the buildings is a sanctuary, and one of the buildings had historically been used as a preschool, but had laid dormant for about 10 years. And so we made the decision to open the doors of that preschool as a part of a cooling center heat respite in conjunction with Maricopa County Association of Governments and the Arizona Faith Network, and the collaboration between local governments and faith institutions to try to provide increased access to cooling spaces. And what started as a really simple idea ended up having us growing into so much more. One of those things that we did is what Morgan just mentioned. We made the initial determination that pets were welcome. We recognized that our unsheltered neighbors and those who were living in that line of almost losing housing, where could they save money? There's a lot of pets involved. And by having a cooling center that would turn away people with pets, we knew we'd be turning away some of the neediest, not to mention those pets need the relief from the heat as well. So we made the decision right away to have the 2 rooms separated. One would be for people with pets, and one would be for people who didn't want to be around them. And the irony of opening that up was that then we started receiving pet food donations and dispensers and food dishes and all of what we needed to not just welcome the pets, but welcome them fully into the space. I realized, though, that we needed funding because, like I said, it was a small church. And so wrote and received a couple of different seed grants that allowed for us to support updating the air conditioning and electrical needs, which of course brought in a person to do the work, the electrical technician. And the way our God works is the electrical technician heard about what we were doing, saw we had 1 refrigerator, and said, hey, we just got a new fridge at home, and donated a 2nd refrigerator. The funding that we received also helped us to purchase single-serve non-perishable food items and laundry supplies, which allowed us to have food on hand and to put into operation an old washer and dryer that were still on site from the preschool days. We also collaborated with other agencies, one of which was a school. So we had nursing students last summer coming out and receiving hours and such towards their nursing degree, one of whom said, hey, people are getting their clothes clean, but what about their bodies? And so that student built us an outdoor rollout shower that has allowed us to have shower access using one of the outdoor water bibs, and allowed people to also get showers. The shower list is usually longer day in and day out as the word gets out into the community. And I know the same thing's happening this summer as well. It's one of the things that people really like. They're able to feel seen in a way that is not often experienced for them. In addition, last summer, we had some plumbing issues. Remember, we're using a preschool building, which means our bathroom facilities are currently plumbed for children, and they were now being used by adults who have limited access to indoor sanitary restrooms. But the thing is the plumber who donated that ended up deciding to not just do the work, but to donate the work. And so what we have found is the more that we reach out and make known what we're doing, the more God shows up to provide in the spaces and places that we would not have been able to do this otherwise. By the end of last summer, this small community of faith, this small church that counts a total of 60 members, we average a weekly attendance of only about 28 people in church. We served over 700 people over the course of 4 months last summer through this work. The testimonies from those served ranged from what sounds like a simple reflection in some ways, but is so life-giving. People talking about how they weighed more at the end of the summer than they could remember in their entire adult life because they had access to the food, the water, and the ability to lay down inside where it was cool to sleep during the day. There were definite reflections of people saying, I really thought I was going to die this summer and then found you guys. And now I was able to live one more summer. Most of all, there were reflections, though, about the love and the acceptance and the peace that the people experienced when they would visit the respite center. They were seen as people, they weren't seen as a problem, and they were welcomed fully as they were, without us trying to change them, while also offering them the opportunity of referrals for housing resources, job resources, substance abuse treatment resources, but nobody was forced to change. It was simply gentle offerings. And so we also saw several successes over the course of last summer, as well as starting into this summer. All of this rolled into a year-round food pantry program. We began a clothing closet because as people came in and were washing their clothes, we started to have volunteers donate clothes. And then the people who were using the laundry facilities would leave their clothes as a way of donation as they got it washed and knowing that they could only carry so much with them. We now have a third refrigerator that has been donated to help support all of the work on site. It allows us to have a balance between our food pantry and resuming the heat respite. We started again this summer, actually back in May. We opened up on May 15th this year for Monday through Friday. 12 to 6 p.m. is what we can do. And we know that's not as big of a thing as is needed. And yet we're doing our part. We are now breaking the 110 mark in Phoenix this week. This weekend, we're looking at 115, 117. And like I said, those lows aren't dropping below 80 degrees. We serve anywhere from 10 to 15 or more people a day in the space, along with pets. And what's wonderful for me as a pastor watching this community develop is we had a very specific community last year, and it's developing into a different community, but every bit as vibrant, loving, and supportive. We see abundant life being transformed in the very boots on the ground kind of way by offering this hospitality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Sylvia. I'm now going to turn it over to Christian Brooks to talk about some of the resources that we're developing to support a lot of this work at Creation Justice Ministries.
Hey everyone, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great, great. So my name is Christian Brooks, as was previously mentioned. Well, let me turn my video on here. Okay, there we go. My name is Christian Brooks. As was previously mentioned, I am a climate and environmental justice consultant at Christian M. Brooks Consulting, or CMB Consulting, and I am very excited to be with you all here to talk about this very important issue and the work that I've been doing with Creation Justice Ministries to create a toolkit of resources for church leaders to use to address this issue. So if you have not been taking notes, that is okay, because we have a lot of great resources for you that you can then use to give to your congregants or to use to advocate. So the first resource that we have is a research paper. So this research paper is going to go into a lot of the things that were discussed on the call today. It talks about what is extreme heat, what is the urban heat island phenomenon, how are communities of color differently impacted by extreme heat. We go into redlining. We even talk about water justice and how that has impact on the increased number of Black and brown folks who are experiencing heat-related illnesses or even dying. And I think I saw a comment where someone asked, how can you take these statistics and advocate to your local government or even the federal government? Well, you can take the research paper and use any of the statistics from there to move the issue forward. There is also a one-page information sheet. So the one-page information sheet just has basic facts from the paper. It also has some tips on how to recognize when you are experiencing a heat-related illness and what should you do. This information sheet can be used as an insert for your church bulletin. It can also be given out to the community. It is printable, or you can distribute it virtually. Next, we have steps on how to become a cooling station. So if there are any churches on the call, or if you know of any churches that are ready to take that next step and become a cooling station, we've created a document that outlines the things that you should think about before becoming a cooling station and steps that you should take to become a cooling station. Then, of course, we have our sermon starters. So the sermon starters are for you to start the conversations with your congregations on the impact of climate change and our role as Christians to actively work to care for all of creation. And then finally, there is a resource guide. So this resource guide has helpful links to more information about extreme heat, such as safety tips, how to protect vulnerable populations, and more. So this webinar was a bit of a preview for what we have been working on. The full resource officially launches next week.
Thank you so much, Christian, for sharing about the great work that we have at Creation Justice Ministries coming up. As Christian said, we will share this resource afterwards. For those who are watching the replay, we will have also the links for those resources in the description box, and everyone who registered will also get a follow-up email that will include the recording and the resources themselves, including our webpage that will have all of those things available for download. And so we are so excited to be able to share that. So we're now going to go to a Q&A section. There are some questions that I wrote down. And so I'm going to turn it so that all of us can be viewed at the same time. And so one of the things that I want to get to, because I think it's so important for us to not only talk about what can our churches do, but also how can we really how can we take actions that will be at the city level, the state level, the national level? And part of that is talking to our government officials. And so I want to get to the question that was asked of how do we use this information to take to our elected officials? And so I would love for any of you to talk about that. And a follow-up question too are, who are the stakeholders that we should be talking to as our churches look to do this work?
Well, I guess I can go ahead and start. I will say for the latter part of your question about the stakeholders, I think there's so many different stakeholders that you can really work with at any level, whether that's at the state level, the city level, the local level. And one of the great things that we have on our website, heat.gov, that I mentioned, we have a planning and preparing page that's broken down by stakeholder group. And so there's a lot of different resources and guides broken down by the different stakeholders, again, that are a great source to be working with. And that includes your public health officials. I think that's one of the most important stakeholder groups that you can work with. One, because they know about heat-related illnesses and know the data about where people are dying from heat-related illnesses. And within that note too, really getting the education out about heat-related illnesses. We did a social media campaign a few weeks ago, and the CDC put out a tweet that asked if people knew the difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke, two very different heat-related illnesses, one being much deadlier than the other, and more than half of people got it wrong. And so it's so important to have that education, and I think working with your public health officials is so important in that aspect. But beyond that too, of course, your local officials are so important. And as I was talking about our urban heat island mapping campaigns, having the data reports from those campaigns have been so helpful and so useful to these local organizations and communities who are looking to take the next step and make that action happen, because having that data a lot of the times is kind of what not only gets decision makers more on board with things, but also a lot of times is what's needed to get the funding for a lot of those efforts too. So again, if you're in any of the communities that have either done an urban heat island mapping campaign or are a current city, or if you're interested in applying for one next year, later this fall, we'll open the application for that. But I think that's another great effort to be able to look into as well.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone want to add to that? Oh, Ella.
Sure. Yeah, I can add, but I'll say to me, these are two big questions that kind of deserve, a lot of time. But I think like this is a place where a lot of people wish they could be, which is connecting the community, like having the trust and relationship with community to be able to say, hey, here is the issue that you are already experiencing, but here's some additional information, but also being able to then connect to, I think Morgan mentioned public health departments, but also there's usually locally people who are doing urban heat or heat work who oftentimes are not connected into community. And so they're trying to sometimes do that education, sometimes do that awareness, but you guys are often that link where you have like the trust of the community. And like that is a really mighty thing to be holding. And how can like when there are new policies passed, when there are city pieces, are you all like showing up in those places to say, actually, like we can engage our constituents, our congregants, the people that we work with, if you're going to represent and show up for us. Because I think that's that place where sometimes people will try to make local policy, but they actually don't have that connection with the community, and they're really trying to sometimes do something helpful, but it doesn't often. But I think you guys are at a really powerful place to be doing this work. And then I'll say there's so many policies that are fantastic, but I can also share some of them later. Some of them that are coming up though are the Green New Deal for health. Anything that is looking at kind of our air quality, of something I think we maybe briefly mentioned, but probably didn't get into depth in, is that air quality and like the contaminants in the air are so much, is really compounded by extreme heat. And that can really be the thing that takes people's health into such a more negative place when these two really bad things compound. And so, yeah, we can happy to also share more resources on different policies coming up at different levels.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. I think it's so important that even if we're not in areas that have the level of extreme heat as a Phoenix or New Orleans or many other states, being in DC right now, we may not have that same level of heat, but we very much have the air quality as a consequence of the increased temperatures that we're seeing in the US as well as Canada as well from wildfires. And so even if we're not in areas of extreme heat, many of us still very much this summer feeling the consequences of what happens with extreme heat when things are not going the way that they're supposed to. So thank you for naming that. Christian, did you want to add to the answers that were just said?
Yeah, I really just want to stress what Ella said in terms of community being very important here, because sometimes we work in silos, right? But it is very important for us to come together and to band our resources in order to affect change when it comes to this issue. When it comes to when it comes to advocating to our elected officials, or even setting up at a cooling station or whatever have you, every church isn't going to be good at everything. So if there's a church that is a great cooling station, but there's a church that does great advocacy, partner up. You don't have to work separately. Partner up, pool your resources so that you can have a amplified voice. So I really appreciate Ella mentioning that. And I just want to stress that, because I know sometimes we can get in our little bubble and work in silos, but it's very important that we come together when it comes to an issue like this.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things as I'm hearing you all, one of the things that I'm wondering about is that for many churches are in small community with each other. Many churches also have strong senior populations who, as Ella's presentation mentioned, are people who are more susceptible, as well as children who are more susceptible at this time, and other populations. And so I'm curious to know, what are things that you all suggest that churches can do to help support everyone, but especially those who are most susceptible to heat-related illnesses during these extremely hot days and nights? I'm curious to hear from you first, Reverend Sylvia, if you don't mind starting off the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last question sort of transitions for this, because one of the things that Wesley has as far as like a perceived barrier would be the senior population of membership. And, you know, they are already in a fragile state, and to have them come out and help staff and monitor. And so we've really leaned into networking and having volunteers through community networking efforts, so that it's not just being staffed by those vulnerable persons that call the church home. But to the point of how do we encourage those who need it, who are vulnerable, to utilize it, I think the biggest thing is conversation to reduce stigma. The reality is we all face things at different points in time that require community help. And so what do we do to reduce the stigma associated with needing help? We have a distorted view socially that tells us we should be able to do it all on our own. And yet, if we lean into our faith, we realize we're a people of community. And so having the conversations and opening it up. And one of the things that we have found is that oftentimes the people who are using the resource end up being some of our best volunteers as well. And so can you encourage those who are more vulnerable to see how their voice and their presence can be beneficial to the whole? And so then it's not just that they're using the resource of the cooling center or the water station or whatever it might be that you're providing at your facilities, but can they be seen as part of the resourcing themselves? And in the process of that, they're able to have access to the life-giving situation.
Yeah, thank you. Morgan?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think there is such a power, especially to churches in a smaller town. So I lived in rural Alabama for a few years and went to a congregation down there and saw just kind of the power that being in a small town and the help that can have from your congregation as well. And I think for extreme heat specifically, you know, one of the great things that churches can do too is implement a buddy system and, you know, go check on your neighbor that, you know, might live alone, might be a little more isolated. Maybe they don't have access to transportation or access to a phone. Maybe, you know, if there's a blackout event happens and people's power goes out, how really just doing a check-in on people who live in your area. I think that's a really great way, especially to help out the older adults in our communities.
I would also like to add putting in place a heat response plan and knowing when it will kick in. So once the temperature reaches X, then we will implement, someone mentioned in the comments, a phone tree, the buddy system, things of that sort, so that you know when you need to be checking in on people and things of that sort.
And I can also add briefly, I think, you know, as we mentioned, like housing in many ways is how we got here, but there are so many, you know, areas to this, but poor housing quality, not having air conditioning, not like sometimes we think when people are home, they're safe because they're not outdoors, but actually if they, you know, lack some of the AC access, cooling stuff, you know, are renting and sometimes, you know, landlords, you do what you can do. That is also a great thing to be checking in on people in their homes and making sure that if there's a possibility for funding for ACs, there's actually more options for that. And that was something that wasn't happening, I think, years ago. People were thinking cooling centers, which is such a beautiful way to come together. But as we mentioned, like with poor air quality, we're trying also to get people to stay home. And then if you don't have AC, you're at risk. So it's really, I think, hard to manage all of these at once. But trying to make sure that people who are vulnerable have air conditioning or like have access to an air conditioning or can get funding for one is also a solution I've seen in some communities that works.
Yeah, thank you. And what I appreciate about that too is the fact that when it comes to some of these solutions, they don't all cost a large amount of money. And so a phone tree or a buddy system, many of these things are low cost. And not to say that air conditioning is not expensive, but it is, you know, potentially more accessible, especially if there's resources that can come or people may have extras or whatever. And so to be able to do that. And so I appreciate that being the case. And if I'm curious with the few minutes that we have left, are there any other suggestions that maybe churches colleges can implement a little bit sooner, because becoming a cooling station, especially if there's infrastructure investments, that may take a little while. But what are maybe some more immediate things that can be done this summer, such as the phone tree idea or a buddy system?
Education. Use our resource. Educate the community on this issue, because I don't think that we all know how deadly extreme heat can be, especially if you don't live in an area like Phoenix, Arizona. DC can get pretty hot as well. And the extreme heat is a danger here as well. So being able to let the community know, one, that this is an issue, looking for resources within the area. If your church cannot become a cooling station, then look for some cooling stations that are in the area. I'm sure there are some. And then also, like I said, the heat response plan, making sure that once the temperature hits a certain amount, this is what we're going to do. This is when the phone tree kicks in. This is when the buddy system kicks in. And yeah, just making sure that people are aware of the resources out there and they know what to do if they are experiencing a heat-related illness, or if the heat is triggering an illness that they already have, because that causes a lot of hospitalizations as well. Respiratory issues, cardiovascular diseases that are pre-existing, the heat can exacerbate that. So just making sure that people are aware, they know their resources, they know where they can go, and if they are in trouble, they know what to do next.
Yes, and one thing I would also add, if there's the means to even think about doing a thermometer giveaway. Not all populations, depending upon someone's age, not everyone is able to fully regulate their bodies temperature-wise. And so some populations, they may not be sweating, but that doesn't mean that they're not experiencing signs of heat exhaustion. And so being able to have even just thermometers to help people be able to regulate, see where their body is regulated, can also help to actually hopefully prevent or to help people get help a lot sooner, especially for children and senior populations. And so thank you so much. I wish we could talk so much longer, but we are out of time. Thank you to everyone for coming to spend this hour with us. As we mentioned before, we will share the extreme heat resources via email. For those on the replay, we will also have it in the description box, the links to them. And so thank you so much. We will follow up with the resources to kind of help. As we said before, we will have resources that can easily be printed off or put into a chat or put into digital bulletins as well. And we will also follow up with contact information for all our panelists if there's any follow-up questions or resources. And we hope this is a campaign that we're doing. So we hope to connect with all of you and many more in the future to talk about these issues more. And so thank you, everyone, and have a blessed evening. Bye.